Hi, this is Grant with Fight for Forensics, and today we're going to be talking about how to do research as well as how to put that research into a usable format that's helpful during rounds. So just an overview, first we're going to talk about where you should go about getting a starting point for your research when a new topic comes out. Then we'll be talking about how to go about finding good information, what are good sources. After that we'll talk about how to go about organizing that information. And lastly, we'll talk about pre-writing responses. Now these are known as blocks. They're just pre-written responses to arguments that you expect to hear in round. So with that in mind, let's talk about a starting point for research. So let's say a new topic comes out. What do? Well, a lot of people start by talking with their other debate friends, seeing what ideas they have. The reason that I don't suggest doing this is rather than using the best arguments in the topic, you'll be narrowing your research just to those most apparent arguments without research, and those might not be the strongest, most well-supported arguments within the topic literature. Another thing that a lot of debaters will do is just read the briefs that their coaches buy, and that'll be it. Now, if you don't know what briefs are, they're just packets of evidence that companies put together and sell. Now, briefs are fine to supplement the research that you do, but you shouldn't be relying on them for a few reasons. First, they're usually put together quickly just so they can hit their deadline, and often they don't have very good information in them in the first place. Second, because briefs are released before the topic begins, you may miss out on a lot of recent topic evidence. Instead, you should always be updating your evidence and updating your research. Third, if you only use briefs, there's a really high chance that other people that you're debating against will have seen your argument before, because they'll also have the brief, and that's not going to be helpful. And fourth, I believe that there's a really big intangible benefit from doing your own research starting from scratch. You'll develop a more holistic understanding of the resolution, which is almost certainly going to come in handy and win you around in some way or another. Another starting point that a lot of people have for research is they'll think of an idea off the top of their head when the topic is released, and they'll just try to, research that specific idea. I wouldn't suggest this, because once again you're limiting your options just not by the strongest arguments, but by the most apparent arguments. So instead, I would recommend learning about the topic first. Look up the key terms of the resolution in Google. This is by far the best way to get a good understanding, because once you put those terms into Google, you're going to be getting the most relevant results, the things that most people are talking about when they're talking about the resolution. Additionally, those first few results will probably have some sort of a summary of what the issues and controversies are in the first place, and that can be very helpful. And I would suggest that you narrow your research as you go. Start with a very broad scope, learn about what the key controversies are, and then find out more about those specific controversies as you go. So now that we know that we should be doing our own research, what are some credible sources we can be looking to? So one thing that's really important in LD is academic journals. Academic journals often have experts in the field delving into really specific issues that are going to be very relevant to a lot of topics. Additionally, news sources can be helpful for getting a broad understanding of the topic or learning about certain controversies that have existed within that topic. Now, one thing that I do want to distinguish is that news sources are very, very helpful for getting that broad understanding, but if you're looking for a really well-warranted argument, you're probably going to be wanting to go to the academic journals just because of that format. Also, just remember to be checking your sources because a credible sounding name isn't enough. If it's an organization that you've never heard of or you don't know good things about, look it up on Google. If you find either nothing or you only find bad things, those should probably be some sort of warning signs to you, and you should probably try to find a better source. Additionally, you could look to a lot of think tanks for research, such as the Cato Institute and some others, although there are some bad think tanks. For the most part, they're very, very good. And what they do is they produce a lot of empirical research, so like statistics and that kind of thing, that you can use to cite your case. However, in LD, just arguing for the most important things that we usually talk about in the topic, that's not enough, because there's also the framework level of debate. So when it comes to learning about philosophy and those types of ideas, there's a couple sources that I would recommend. The first is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and similarly there's the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Now both of these are just encyclopedias of philosophy with entries on pretty much every single big idea in philosophy, and they're also written by really credible people. Most generally they're written by professors of philosophy. One thing that I know that certain new debaters have had issues with the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is that sometimes the writers write in a somewhat confusing way. If you're having any sort of troubles, I would suggest going to the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. They do a very good job, and I find that they're usually a little bit easier to understand. Additionally, academic journals can also be helpful. I wouldn't suggest using them just to get a broad overview of what an ethical theory says, but once you're looking at specific issues and problems within an ethical theory, that's where academic journals come into play. And finally, you could read primary sources for philosophy. That is, the books that those big-name philosophers wrote in the first place that we're still talking about today. Now, I personally don't always suggest this. Oftentimes, those original books can be very long and very dry, as well as very difficult to read. So a lot of times the summaries do a better job of giving you an understanding of philosophy or specific ethical theories that are going to be necessary for debate. But if you've got the time and you feel like that's something you want to do, you go ahead and read primary sources. It can't hurt you. So now that we've talked a fair amount about how to get research in the first place, how should we go about organizing it? In debate, we generally accept that if you're going to be using some sort of evidence, your opponent has to be able to have access to that evidence in a round. In other words, I can't just say that John Smith made this statement or gave this statistical analysis without anything to back it up. Like, I can't just require that my opponent trust me on that. Rather, in debate, we have a specific means of incorporating and keeping track of evidence that lets us shorten the evidence and summarize it while still preserving the source material to a certain extent. And that's called using a card. So we'll talk about what a card is right now. So a card is just a shortened version of a block of text. If you've got a really long passage, for the sake of time, you're not going to be able to read everything. So rather, you only read the parts of that text that are essential. So for an example here, let's say you began with this passage. Now, to be clear, most passages are going to be a lot longer than this. This is just something short I typed up just to show the principle. So how a card works is you take the parts of it that you're going to say, you underline them, make them bold, and the parts you don't say, you make smaller, so it's easier to gloss over them as you're reading the parts that you do want to say. Additionally, just so you can keep track of your cards better, after you format them, you also add a citation, and then you add a tagline or a title or introduction to that card. So we'll look at an example here in a second. I'll actually cut a card with you just so we can understand how that process works. But if you're having trouble understanding how the idea of this small text versus this underlined text works, it's actually pretty simple. If you've ever written an essay with ellipses, it's much the exact same thing. So just like in an essay, you can begin with one part of the passage and then indicate that you're skipping to another, you can do the same thing in debate. It's just instead of using ellipses, you keep the original text there, you just make it smaller. This way, if your opponent wants to see it, you can show it to them without there being some worry that you cut out, maybe a word like not, or something else that would really change the meaning of the text. To understand what a card looks like, let's go ahead and look at an example that I already made. So this is just something I made up. So here we've got our block of text about why petting puppies is good. It's a statement by Barack Obama. And obviously that's indicated in the title here. Petting puppies makes everyone happy, and that's from Barack Obama in 2014. You can also see that right under the tagline or title, there's the citation information, and you should put a URL there if you have one. It'll make it easier to find later. So how cutting the card works is you take the parts of the statement that are relevant to the arguments that you're trying to make, and you make those ones big, bold, and underlined. In contrast, those parts that you're not going to read that aren't really relevant to your argument or that you want to cut out for the sake of time, those are the things you just make smaller. That way when you're reading the card, it's really easy to go ahead and remember that you're not going to read that. So now let's go ahead and cut a card here just so you can understand how this works. Now, one thing that I want to be clear about is that there's a really cool template from Microsoft Word made that's called Verbatim. Now, Verbatim is a really awesome template in that it helps us organize our research as well as cut cards, and it's made specifically for debate. So I'm going to be using that template, and the instructions that I give you are going to be within the context of that template. But if you don't have Microsoft Word, you can still do the exact same things I'm doing. It just won't be automated like Verbatim has it automated. And the card we're about to cut will be for the resolution resolve just governments ought to require that employers pay a living wage. So as you can see, we've got an article from Forbes in which there's some guy giving an opinion piece on a minimum wage and why it's bad. So what I've done is I've taken the part of the passage that I think is going to be relevant, and I've copied it and I'm going to paste it into Verbatim so that we can cut it down. So now we're back to our Word document and we're about to paste this in here. One thing that's important is whenever you're pasting text into Verbatim that isn't formatted in another Verbatim document, you're always going to want to paste it using the paste function or by pressing F2. Now the reason we're going to want to be using the paste function as opposed to just right-clicking and clicking paste is that this button is designed to remove all of the weird and wonky formatting that you're otherwise going to get whenever you paste from a different document. It keeps everything uniform and easy to work with. So let's paste that here. And now I'll just go ahead and highlight the parts that are going to be relevant for the argument that I'm going to be making using this article. So I'm just going to highlight this part, and then I guess we'll go this part. So after you've underlined the parts that you want to read, you're going to want to make sure it's all one paragraph. As you can see here, there are a bunch of different paragraphs that the article is in. That's how it was cut up. So instead, highlight the entire thing, and Verbatim gives you a way to do this easily, and that's by clicking the Condense button. So as you can see here, we've got just one big paragraph now. So obviously, if you were in a round and you wanted to bring this in with you and it was part of your case, you aren't going to want to just bring this entire thing in here because it's going to take up a whole lot of paper and it might be a little bit difficult to understand what you want to read and what you don't want to read, especially if some of the text that's underlined is, say in the middle of the passage versus pretty much at the beginning and the end like it is in this example. So how we make the text smaller is we highlight the entire paragraph, and once again, this is why we want to make it into one paragraph. That makes it easier to use verbatim. And we're going to want to go over to the shrink button, and that'll bring it to size 8 font as opposed to the default, which was set to size 11 for me. And you can click this a few times to make it smaller. I think verbatim lets you go all the way down to 4. So now that we've got our text and it's cut, all we need to do is add a citation and add a tagline. So in terms of adding a citation, just go ahead and add all of the information that you would need if you were to find the article, independently. So if you gave your opponent the citation information, hypothetically after the round they should be able to find it themselves and ensure that you weren't lying in the first place. So I'll just go ahead and add that citation information myself, and I'll skip forward to when it's done. I went ahead and added the citation information, and it doesn't have to be in any particular order, whatever you're most comfortable. Just do that. It's not like anybody's going to be checking for MLA formatting or anything like that. What I personally like to do with the citation is after I put it in there, I like to reduce it just to a little bit smaller font, just so it's still on there, it's still readable, but at the same time it's easier for me to distinguish what I'm reading on the paper versus what I'm not reading on the paper. So the last thing that we need is a tagline. Now, a tagline for evidence is just a summary of the evidence. And the reason that we want to always have taglines is, first, when you're doing your own research, it makes it a lot easier to stay organized because you're giving everything a title. And second, you always want to have a tagline when you're reading evidence in a round so that the judge knows what they're about to hear. If you just go into evidence, it's going to be very difficult for the judge to comprehend what's happening. Rather, you want to introduce it to him first. So the tagline for this card is just going to be something like, minimum wage laws are coercive. James Dorn explains for Forbes in 2013. Just something that tells the judge what it is that they're about to hear and includes some sort of the citation in there. Because you don't want to just be reading evidence without telling anybody anything about the source. That kind of makes it meaningless and defeats the purpose of evidence. And after that, you're going to want to highlight this, and verbatim gives a really cool function. It has a tagline function, and that's going to make it really easier to navigate through your research, and we'll talk about that right now. So what we've done so far is we've cut a card. But as you're cutting multiple cards, as you're getting a lot of research together as you should be, it might be difficult to stay organized, and this is where verbatim's strong suit is. So the only functions we've gone over are those that cut cards, but there's also a lot of other important functions with verbatim. Now the organizational functions are the pocket, hat, block, and tag buttons. So as you can see, there's a document pane right here, and these buttons affect the document pane. So whenever we add a pocket, that's the first and largest level of organization, and as you can see, it shows up right here outside in our document pane. Similarly, there's the hat function, which is just a layer smaller than that, and then there's the block function. Now, what this lets you do when you have a lot of information is it lets you create a lot of subcategories that are easier to work through. So we'll go to a document which I've created a number of subcategories just to show you an example of how this might be helpful. So as you can see here, this document's got a number of different pockets, each with their own hats and their own blocks within those hats. So this is going to be helpful once you have a lot of information, because let's say you wanted to go to your evidence for the affirmative, and you wanted to go to your economic impact arguments, and you wanted to look to your reducing unemployment arguments. Now obviously this is just meaningless, it doesn't apply to any resolution, and this stuff's going to be filled in, it's going to depend on the research you're getting. But the important thing is that whatever you have, you're going to be able to categorize it, you're going to be able to keep track of everything a lot easier. And if you're doing a lot of research, it's going to be essential that you're able to navigate through it, and that's verbatim's strong suit. Once again, this program is called Verbatim, and it's a template for Microsoft Word. I would highly suggest installing it. The final thing that we're going to be talking about today are blocks. Now blocks are simply put pre-written responses to arguments that you expect to hear. Now the reason that it's really advantageous to pre-write responses is it lets you come up with better responses, as well as create responses that have less filler words in them, just more efficient responses so that you can get more responses out in your limited time frame. Think of how many good responses you could come up with to an argument with 1 minute, and then imagine as though you had 2 hours to prepare. It's going to be a very big discrepancy. And consequently, I've noticed that the biggest factor between being a very successful debater versus one who isn't very successful is preparation. And one of the most important yet often overlooked parts of preparation is pre-writing those responses. It'll be very helpful. So in terms of what arguments you should write responses to, the answer is just about anything you can imagine your opponent saying. But if you're confused as where to begin with this, I'll just go over a few different places just so you could be hitting the common bases. First, try to block out the main arguments that you're finding in briefs. there's a very good chance that your opponent pretty much just uses the briefs and doesn't do their own research. So if you've got arguments prepared against pretty much all the main briefs, there's very, very few scenarios in which you're going to be unprepared for your opponent's argument. Similarly, make sure you're blocking out all of the key issues that you see in the topic literature. If it's a really important argument that a lot of people in the academic fields are talking about, then it's something that's probably going to come up in some way or another. And the more educated you are on that issue is always going to be a good thing. On some resolutions, some statistics are really important. For example, on the living wage resolution, a lot of times unemployment was a really, really important thing. So you might have a statistics debate about whether or not raising the minimum wage is going to cause unemployment. So whenever there's really, really important statistics that are going to perhaps determine a round, you should always be prepared on both sides for those stats. One thing to block out that often goes overlooked is creating responses to your own arguments. It's very, very rare that you're running an argument that nobody else is going to be running. If your argument's actually that good, the odds are somebody else has thought of it, so you should always be prepared to go against it. If nobody else is running it, then there's probably a good chance that it's not a very good idea to begin with. But especially if it's a very good idea, you never want to be unprepared when you're going against it. Additionally, I'd suggest blocking out any arguments that you've heard in round. One phrase that I've heard is that there's no excuse to lose to the same argument twice. And even if you beat the argument the first time you hit it, you didn't lose the round, you should always be nonetheless blocking it out so that the next time you hit it, you can be even more prepared and you can beat it even better. In debate, preparation is always worth it. And there's never going to be a harm to writing more blocks and being more prepared. The worst case scenario is that you don't use them. One cute phrase I came up with to incorporate this is, when in doubt, block it out. So in terms of how to actually write these blocks and put them onto paper, I would suggest including a few different things, just a few factors you might want to consider. First, start by writing down every response off of the top of your head. If nothing else, this will help you figure out what most other people are probably going to say right off the top of their head. And if it's in response to one of your own arguments, it'll help you know which responses to prepare for. Additionally, after you've done this, you should do some research to supplement those responses, as well as figure out what the other responses are. Even if you think that you've come up with a really good response, see if anybody else, any experts in the field, have worded that response differently. Maybe they've written it in such a way that it's a lot more persuasive than the way that you originally came up with it. And I would suggest that for most blocks, especially for common issues, have at least 3 responses. Now, while it's definitely true that having more responses isn't always better, because there's a very good chance you'll lose your judge if you read, 7 responses, if you have a number of different responses to each argument, it's going to make answering those a lot harder for your opponent. If you give your opponent only 1 response, they know where they can focus their time. But if you give them 3 well-developed responses for every argument that they read, that's going to be very, very difficult to manage because they're going to be pressed for time. And because you can always be pressed for time too, I would suggest ordering your responses from best to worst. This is because if you're time crunched, you don't want to have to spend time in prep figuring out which arguments you're going to read, which ones you won't. If you just have them ordered from best to worst, you can just say, I have time to read 2 responses here, and then just read numbers 1 and 2. It'll make things a lot simpler. And when you're writing blocks, try to maximize your word efficiency. Now let's say that you were to come up with a response to an argument off the top of your head. Now, in a lot of debate rounds, because you're thinking on your feet, you might be thinking out the response as you're saying it. And blocks are really helpful here because if you think about the argument ahead of time, you can figure out which parts of your response are actually essential and which ones are just filler words, or maybe you're explaining something too much, or you're giving 2 different analogies, something like that you can cut out. If you maximize word efficiency, you can maximize the number of responses that you make as well as increase their strength. The point is you want to cut out totally unnecessary things. And finally, don't just read cards for your blocks, and this is something that I really want to stress. A lot of debaters who do a lot of research think that they can win the round just by showing their judge that they have all this research and their opponent doesn't, so they know more about debate so they win. This isn't how it works. While most judges certainly think there's some value in having research, a lot of judges also recognize a value in demonstrating that you can analyze that research or that you can come up with your own responses. So if you want to read cards, that's more than fine. Just make sure you're also providing some sort of your own analysis after the card, and also consider just reading some responses that aren't necessarily substantiated by evidence. If an argument is just logically wrong, feel free to explain why it's logically wrong. Somebody else doesn't need to say it for it to be true. So that's all we have for today. I hope that this has helped you out, and one thing that I just want to remind you with is that when it comes to debate, preparation is always worth it. There's no harm to reading more on the topic. This has been Grant with Fight for Forensics. Thank you and see you next time.